Good morning and welcome to Advancing with Watercolor. In the next few videos, I'm going to be talking about working outside on location and the importance of doing that. In this particular series, I've returned to Boston from a trip to New York City, where we painted outside in Central Park, Times Square, and Bryant Park, and the Brooklyn Bridge. We had a great week. Lucky with the weather, we had fantastic weather, and so we were able to work outside every day. This is our first motif, a cafe in Central Park, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it. It's a beautiful cafe, and the light was on the cafe. It was early morning, and we gathered around 9 a.m., and we had a beautiful view of this cafe with morning light running up the hill, striking the awnings, and creating a wonderful motif. So this is the finished piece, but I'm going to walk you through the steps. When we set up in the field, it's important to think of a couple of things. One is a good view. Maybe that goes without saying, but a good view is very important because we need to be able to see aspects of our subject that are going to contribute to the painting, and we need to be able to see the light. However, that doesn't mean you have to necessarily face your subject. This painting was done looking away from my subject so that I could take advantage of shade and stay out of the way of people moving to and fro. So I had my back to the subject when I painted this, and there's some benefits to doing that for the artist in the open air. One of the benefits is that you're not constantly looking up and distracting yourself from what's happening in the painting. And then what also happens, as each glance that you make towards your subject, you're really searching for something that's going to help you in the painting. So I find this method of either facing away from the subject or to the side of the subject very helpful for the painting process, much less distracting than if you're constantly looking up, constantly measuring, constantly comparing your painting to what's in front of you. And I can recommend this for everybody who's working outside. It also gives you more options as to how you position yourself. We want to be comfortable, we'd like to be in the shade, not have direct light on our painting. So this way of setting up can be advantageous. Well, here you see the first washes, light tones, the sky, the rooftop, the awnings themselves. I place these washes that are quite diluted colors, very light colors, and put this in the sun to dry. I let it dry, and I anticipate working with stronger colors and sharp edges onto the dry paper. This is one thing that can be sort of disconcerting to the watercolorist, because when we're out of doors, our painting tends to dry 2 or even 3 times faster than in the studio. So often we get caught in the process of making a big wash, and our painting has just surprised us by how fast it's been drying. And we are, I guess we're just discombobulated for a few moments, and we get accidentals like cauliflowers and streaks to our big washes, which we're not used to. So another technique, another way of approaching the watercolor is to compartmentalize it, to think in terms of stages, smaller areas, which will make it easier to manage, and putting that into your watercolor plan and trying to isolate the areas that you're going to work on, and then stay within that small area until you feel you can move on. So here's the first stage dry. Now I'm going to be working above, and I'm trying to keep a certain tempo with my brush. If you notice, I'm flicking it, I'm dragging it, I'm kind of pointing with it, all to create this feeling of overhead foliage. I'm leaving a bit of sky, that bit of sky, especially on the right-hand side of the roof, I found to be important to identify the beauty of the structure that I enjoyed looking at. And as I'm painting shadows into the foliage, I'm also flicking the brush. You'll notice that I get some drips here and there. This is intentional. I'm trying to generate a feeling of leaves kind of falling down towards my subject, and also a feeling of a randomness to those leaves. I feel that's important. This random quality can be tricky to emulate. In other words, we don't want to splatter the whole painting, but with practice and a little experience, you can aim the brush so that you get the splatter where you want it. After doing this, you see the nice pattern that's achieved in the foliage above. So one of the things that I talked about was thinking about your subject in terms of design and giving some thought to the painting process before you even start mixing your colors. This stage is important, thinking about how you're going to use the foreground, how you're going to use the background, where your main subject is going to reside, what you're trying to say in your painting. In fact, throughout the series of classes, I asked my students to think about a title before they even started their painting. I want to know what your subject is about, what you're trying to convey, before we even consider the watercolor plan, before we even touch the paper. What are we trying to say? And this title, my title, is Morning Light on the Cafe, actually more specifically, Morning Light on Le Plein Quotidien. I know I'm mispronouncing it, but I like the sound of the cafe, so I'm using that in my title. But really, in essence, I'm thinking morning light. How can I capture the morning light on the awnings, on the figures, on the rooftop, etc.? The view that we had was looking up the hill towards the cafe. So what I'm doing is keeping the background rather abstract and not too strong, and really giving some strength to how I bring out the awnings and the figures in front of the awnings. And then the foreground, my plan is to have just simple graded wash that leads up to the figures and joins with the figures in the, at least in the center part. And by that I mean the tonality of the figures and the tonality of the grass at that point is very similar, so they almost feel joined. And this is the composition. One of the things that, as I'm designing, that I'm trying to consider is offsetting things as much as I can. What I mean by that is I try not to overly center the focal point. I try to keep from dividing up the painting into equal parts. The roof peak is slightly to the right. There's a little more activity in central than the left side of the cafe. These little offsets can really make a big difference in the overall composition and the enjoyment of the painting. So I think about that as I'm sketching in the subject. How can I create a good composition that is taking from my motif, but perhaps exaggerating some aspects and diminishing others, and creating a little bit of a feeling of imbalance, or actually we can say a little bit of energy with the composition. This is one thing that I try to avoid, is over-centering my subject. So my center of interest is a little low in the painting, with a minor center of interest in the cupola up on top, or opening in the sky, but largely the figures that are, and the awning that is receiving the bright morning light. So we talked a lot about composition, about thinking things through before you start your painting, making some idea to form a watercolor plan, that is, stages. And then once I start painting, I try not to think at all. I try to simply respond to what's happening with the media. And because I want to be able to give as much attention as I can to what's happening on the paper at that moment. I do all my thinking, all my planning prior to starting the painting. Well, here you can see the center of interest is really starting to develop, largely because of those rich darks I'm placing behind the awning, under the rooftop, under the awning, and coming to bear on the seated figures at the cafe. I'm trying to get a feeling that they're coming forward, that they're a little closer to us, and that the awnings to the right and left are important, but they're receding and they're becoming a little vaguer through means of painting shadows across the figures, a little more color into the figures, and even on the right side I'll be darkening, making the figures a little darker. And at this point I'm using paint that's quite strong, quite rich, quite dark. As we're painting, of course, the light is changing, and this is going to happen almost everywhere you work. And it's for the outdoor artist, the person who is working in plein air, as they say. It can be a challenge because in one moment you see shadows going one direction, the next moment they're much shorter or sometimes not even there. So how do you adjust to that? How do you respond to that? One of the things that I do is when I'm sketching my scene, I'll make lines that indicate the direction and length of the shadows. And basically these are to remind me when it comes to making brush strokes, such as you see in the roof, or as you'll see later across some of the figures, to remind me which direction the shadows were being cast, and sort of the length of those shadows. I find that to be very helpful. Of course, we can take a photo and should take a photo of that moment that we're trying to capture. That can be helpful as well. I do find it hard to look at a photo when I'm outside. For some reason, the screen is not as vivid as I would like. Sometimes even in the shade, I cannot see it as well as I would like. So the pencil lines that I make in placing the drawing help me to remember the angle and length of shadows. And for me, this is an important part of working outside, especially on a day like today where we have this beautiful light. And I should say, we are quite lucky with the light today. And when I arrived in New York yesterday, it was just raining cats and dogs. I was worried that would extend into our week, but luckily we had a fantastic week. And the light seems even more brilliant because we've been living in these rainy days in the Northeast for the past, it seems like a month of rain that we've been enduring. And so to get outside and have a day like today is really a treat. It's just joyous, and everybody is enjoying it. So I'm continuing my work carrying this dark that's under the rooftop to the right. And it's not quite as, when you look at the scene, I'm taking some liberties here because it's not as cut and dry, shall we say, as I'm painting it. There are highlights on the figures which I will place later, but this is done to make the front figures feel more luminous, feel more important, feel more energized by the light. You can think of this as a director might think of his staging. We have our main characters, we have supporting characters, and they all play a role in the finished piece. And I think it's pretty clear where my main characters are, and it's pretty clear where my supporting characters are. They're all important, but the adjustments are made to what we see so that the painting is more readable and more powerful. This is what we call a center of interest, or a focal area. I find it very helpful to sort of declare that early on, even before I start painting, In fact, it has a direct bearing on the title, which we are stating even before we paint. We're titling our work. And this helps to give us focus on our subject, what we're trying to communicate through the whole painting process. In fact, it's also useful if you run into trouble. If you're struggling with an area, it's not working well with the corresponding areas. We remind ourselves of what the title is, and it helps us to make some critical decisions along the way. So we can get away with some vague areas in the background, some soft, gentle areas, underdefined areas in the foreground and periphery. We're trying for a feeling of sharpness and brilliance in our main figures and our center of interest. And this helps us to kind of continue and finish the painting with the idea of our title, with the idea of what we want to communicate, etc. So I'm in the final stages of this painting. You can see my hand is down on the brush. I'm doing some detail work, very important work, because as I was painting under the umbrella, I pretty much lopped off the heads of my figures and was left with shoulders. Now I'm going back to these areas and putting on what I feel are some important highlights. And I'm doing this using, it's transparent watercolor made by Holbein. One color is titanium white. Another color is jaune brilliant, which is an opaque color that has a bit of yellow to it. So depending on the sort of ambient color, if it's a warm color, I tend to use the jaune brilliant to retrieve a highlight. If it's not a warm color, I'll use more of the titanium white. And I prefer this method, and I'll explain why. When I'm doing a large wash like you see behind the figures, I don't want to be too impeded by cutting around very small shapes. I'd rather be able to drag the brush up with a little more expression and a little more freedom, and with the idea that I can return to areas that are lost, in this case the heads, and add a bit of opaque paint to recapture them. I find keeping the integrity of a big wash, a large wash, much more important than trying to cut around and losing the quality of your wash because I'm cutting around too many small things. Here you see me adjusting the foreground wash. This is done at the end of the painting. I feel that it's dried a little paler than I would like. I'd like to feel the light running up to meet the scene, so I'm putting a little more shadow in the lower corners. I'm blurring the sides of the painting just a little bit, but this is pretty much the final painting. Let's have a look. And yes, here you see the final piece. The light that I saw in this morning is pretty well portrayed. I'm enjoying the pattern of shadows, the brushwork on the top and in the foliage, the strong placement of awnings and figures I feel is successful. So, you know, our painting experience in the outdoors is not always to our liking, because we're fighting so many things, because we're working against the clock with watercolor, because we're trying to manage a lot, and we're quite often distracted by spectators and people coming in front of us and all these things. But for me, the experience is so important to stand out in the light and to observe your subject under the natural light. We cannot get that from a photograph. We cannot get it any other way, I feel, than to go outside and paint. So as the weather warms, I really recommend everyone to get outside and sketch and paint. You can start in areas that aren't so public and work yourself up to standing in a place like New York City in Central Park and Times Square. It's a great experience, and I hope you enjoy the following series of videos.